Hello there. Today I'm finishing off my look at the bottles of 1999 vintage wines that we bought to celebrate Wine Searcher's 25th birthday. So this is a bottle rather curiously labelled as Mazuran's Vintage Port 1999. And if you haven't heard of Mazurans as a port house, that's hardly surprising, because Mazurans are actually based in Auckland, in the suburb of Henderson, near Lincoln Road, and really they're a little bit of a throwback to the way that winemaking was in the Auckland region 20, 30, maybe even 40 years ago. I assume that it's legal to sell this as vintage port in New Zealand, so I guess that the legislation which has gone ahead in places like Australia, preventing the terms vintage port being used for wines other than those made in the Douro Valley and shipped through Oporto, don't apply here. I mean, I suspect the New Zealand market is very small, and it hasn't been felt the need to apply the protection of that wine name to our tiny market here in the Pacific. But Mazurans as a company really rather encapsulates the winemaking here in Auckland for a period in the mid-20th century. And small family-owned wineries made quantities of fortified wine, which they would have sold locally. Now, George Mazuran, the founder here, came to New Zealand in 1926 from Dalmatia. Many of the winemaking families of this area have Croatian origins, as did the Mazurans. And very classically, George worked as a gum digger, digging in swampland for something called kauri gum, which was quite hard work, but a lucrative way of earning money. And through doing that, he saved up and he bought himself a plot of land alongside Lincoln Road near the town of Henderson, at that stage a town just outside Auckland. Now today, Lincoln Road is a main arterial road running from the northwestern motorway through to the suburb of Henderson. So today Mazurans are the last of a large number of these small vineyards and orchards that would have run right along Lincoln Road to remain, and there they sit between fast food restaurants, car lots, furniture shops and supermarkets as a sort of a last memory of the winemaking that went on here in the middle of the last century. Now, George bought this land in 1938. He produced his first vintage in 1942. And if you go to the winery today, they appear to have vintages, almost as if they have every vintage right back to 1942. There certainly is a superb collection of old wines. But George actually made his name as a political lobbyist. New Zealand in the 1950s had some really over-stringent licensing laws, and George believed in advocating for the small family wine producer, and became a very successful political lobbyist in get these laws changed. In fact, he was labelled at the time by some commentators as the 81st member of the New Zealand Parliament. He seemed to spend so much time there. And he was able to do this, evidently, because members of the Dalmatian community around him helped tend his vines, and his wife Florence made the wine. She was the only female winemaker in New Zealand at the time. And George became the head of the Viticultural Association in 1950, gaining the OBE for his services to the wine industry in 1971. Now, all this is history that predates even this rather elderly bottle. I mean, George died in 1982 and was succeeded by his son-in-law, Rado Hadilio. Today they've expanded their production beyond fortified wines, although that is still their speciality, and they do make table wine as well. Alas, the vines are gone from Lincoln Road. The hectare and a half of vines, I believe, was replaced in 2019 by olive trees. So there is still a small olive grove behind the winery. Now, I really don't know very much, I haven't been able to find out very much about the wine itself. It had occurred to me that it wouldn't have been unusual, certainly in the 60s, for wine producers in this part of the world to be making wine from hybrid grape varieties, because in the rather wet climate here, the hybrids often do quite well. They're more resistant to rot than Vitis vinifera. However, this is 1999. It's not a completely ancient bottle of wine. The New Zealand wine industry's moved on quite a long way by 1999, and I would expect the planting of Vitis vinifera to have been widespread. Notes I've seen suggest that they had plantings of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot in the vineyards here in Lincoln Road. So I would suspect that that's probably what this particular wine is made from. The other point to make is that making a fortified wine, you need a spirit with which to fortify the base wine, something which traditionally a lot of wineries would have made, and certainly Mazurans continue making their own spirit for their fortified wines. Because they're still making wine, they're just not growing their own grapes. They are bringing grapes in from the greater Auckland area, and in some cases from Marlborough and from Hawke's Bay. So they're still making wines here, even if not with fruit grown on Lincoln Road. So if you're making a port, the essence of that would be that you have a brief fermentation, after which the wine is drained from the skins and then fortified. And the fortification at that stage will raise the alcohol to an extent that it stops the fermentation and enables the wine to be stable, despite the fact it still has sweetness. Again, I'm not exactly sure how the wines would have aged, but I would imagine, given the nature of the operation, probably in larger seasoned oak barrels. So I'm not expecting there to be an oak influence, rather more a sort of an aging and an oxidation. Even then, I would expect a wine that's labelled as vintage port, and I could be wrong in expecting this, but I'd expect a wine that's labelled as a vintage port to have been bottled relatively young, a year or so after harvest, and to have done most of its aging in the bottle, so sealed, and so for the large part without the influence of air. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? Looking at it, there's a deep colour. I can't really say that it's red. It's almost a black treacle molasses sort of colour there. The wine is 19% alcohol, and it's a sweet wine as well. So there's plenty of viscosity there. I can see the wine sticking to the glass, and it's actually taking its viscosity is such that it's taking a while to form tears on the glass. So let's see what make of the aroma, shall we? The aromas are powerful and rich. They're very mellow. They're very developed. There's almost a sort of an aroma of a dusty old furniture, you know, polished wood. Slightly nutty, lifted, ripe hazelnut notes. There are hints of cream caramel, that sort of thing. There's a certain richness to it. Sometimes people describe old and slightly oxidised fortified wines as having an aroma of cheese balls. It's not necessarily a complimentary description. There's just the slightest hint of this, but actually this is more sort of rounded with sort of lifted spiritiness. Perhaps even a hint of treacle. It's more spirity. There's not even a sort of a lifted sultana note or something like that. Even that is sort of integrated into notes of old wood and that sort of thing. So that's for taste. On the palate, that's sweet and rich. It's warming. That's where I'm getting the notes of dried fruit, raisin, sultana, fig, lovely sweetness. And then there's a touch of quite vivid charcoal almost running through the middle of that, just showing you that the wine's aged in barrel, showing a touch of oxidation, but the oxidation hasn't dried this out. As I say, it's rounded, it's dried figs, it's sultanas, that sort of lovely rounded richness. The sweetness is very well harmonised with the lovely mellow flavours as well. There's nothing standing out in this. There's a note of spirit, but with that there's a sort of almost a sort of a slight anise touch, and that helps to blend it in with this rich, ripe fruit. There are almost ways in which this is sort of like an Oloroso sherry, I suppose. There's that slight touch of oxidation coming through. There's that richness. It's not quite as sort of cloying as a Pedro Jimenez sherry might be. It is more that sort of lovely, rich, figgy note that would be classic for Wairarapa port from Portugal as well. The flavours last really well. There isn't a really obvious acidity on this, but when I'm looking for the length of the wine, it's lasting really well. So I think actually there is pretty reasonable acidity on this too. From a wine that's 25 years old and from a really small, hardly known winery, I'm hugely impressed with this wine. It's a very enjoyable experience and a lovely surprise. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. If you felt like following us on YouTube, that would be fantastic to have your support. Any comments you have, please leave those in the box below. We'd love to get your feedback on this or any of the other wines that we've been talking about in these tastings. Please, if you have any friends you think would be interested in seeing the video, feel free to share it with them. But most importantly, do please try and take some time and come and join us for another tasting in the very near future, won't you? Thanks again. Bye for now.